We had Norman Finkelstein recently, and we discussed his book on Gaza and Inquest into its martyrdom. And we discussed this complicated topic of self-defense. And back in the days when he wrote the book, he said that his diagnosis, as I read it, was that since there is a significant asymmetry of military power, it's perhaps like civil disobedience, peaceful protest, and so on, that would eventually be the way forward for the peace.
Well, I would start by saying that when it comes to resistance, I would rule nothing out that does not violate the laws of war. And that even if a non-violent strategy is decided by Palestinian consensus, even in such cases, the right to use armed force should never be renounced.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us a very special guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin is a Middle East analyst specializing in Arab-Israel conflict and Palestinian affairs. He is also the co-editor of Jadalia and a contributing editor to the Middle East Report. Mouin, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
I wanted to start with your brief sort of introductory statement about what's going on in Palestine at the moment. Last month has been mostly reading reports from Rafah, but then we saw also escalation in the north, including attacks on Jabalia refugee camp, but also Al Sifa, Al Auda hospitals are at the brink of collapse. And now we are really getting horrifying reports from central Gaza that really includes the recent strike in the UN school. Tell us about what's going on in Gaza.
Well, it's a little difficult to give a very brief response to your question because there are several things going on. Most prominently, of course, there is genocide going on and has been going on now for almost 9 months, in which Israel is seeking to basically pulverize Gaza to make it unfit for human habitation through the systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure, the systematic destruction, for example, of the health and education sector, of housing stock, of these indiscriminate attacks on residential homes, on hospitals, on schools, on centers for displaced persons, resulting in this absolutely massive casualty toll, which we've seen over the past 8 months. And I, for one, am fairly confident that if and when a final tally can be made, it will prove to be quite significantly higher than the numbers we currently have at our disposal. And I think Israel's objective here is to make the Gaza Strip as a territory unfit for human habitation in the hope and expectation that the population, if it can't be forcibly expelled, will engage in so-called voluntary emigration. For example, either try to breach the wall with the Egyptian border or get into boats to try to make it to Europe, because same kinds of things we've seen with Syrian refugees during the past decade. So that's one thing that's going on. The other thing that's going on is that Israel has continued its military campaign with the intention of seeking the destruction of Hamas as a military force and as a governing authority. That has proven to be an abject failure almost a year into this war by the most powerful military force in the region against a second order militia in a postage stamp sized territory. The Gaza Strip is all of 365 square kilometers. It has still not managed to either eliminate the leadership of Hamas or significantly degrade its military capabilities in terms of command, control, communications, weaponry, um, uh, propaganda, and so on. And it's to many analysts, it's becoming quite clear that Israel has set itself unattainable objectives. So then we have to ask, if that is the case, why is Israel continuing with this war instead of cutting its losses? And I think there's a fairly clear explanation for that. And the conventional explanation is that the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, wants to indefinitely continue this war because the end of the war would spell the end of his political career and the resumption of various legal cases involving primarily corruption against him. I think the explanation is a little different. Um, Netanyahu's personal considerations are certainly one consideration, but there is also, let's say, the collective determination of the entire Israeli leadership, its politicians, its government ministers, and the security establishment, who themselves have described the Palestinian attacks of 7 October 2023 into southern Israel as the most painful blow administered to Israel since it was established in 1948. That means that they are the ones responsible for this failure. And by continuing this war, they're hoping to make achievement, to reach certain strategic achievements, so that when the time for accountability and taking responsibility comes, they can offset their failures last year with their achievements this year. But again, by all accounts, that's simply not going to happen.
I think this is a good point to talk a little bit about the instability within the Israeli ruling coalition, particularly in context of the recent Biden ceasefire plan. The ceasefire plans obviously includes prisoner hostages swap, withdrawal of an immediate ceasefire, withdrawal of Israeli military immediately from the densely populated areas, but eventually full withdrawal and ultimate reconstruction, eventual reconstruction of Gaza. It seems to the ceasefire's plan seems to have divided the Israeli ruling coalition. The extreme elements like the Ben Gvirs and the Smotrich have seen this as a sort of conceding defeat to Hamas, while there are other ultra right conservative groups which have welcomed this in the interest of the prisoners or hostages. Can you tell us a little bit about the ceasefire and its impact on the Israeli ruling coalition?
Well, I think we first need to recognize that for all intents and purposes, Israel currently has two governments. Now, what do I mean by that? The formal government is the governing coalition, which consists of those parties that have assembled a parliamentary majority and appointed government ministers and so on, just as you would have in any other government. But in addition, Israel is currently also being run by what it calls a war cabinet. And that body is formed of a small number of government ministers, the prime minister, the defense minister, and maybe one or two others, who are members of the governing coalition, but also includes two prominent members of the Israeli opposition who are not members of the ruling coalition. And I think this is part of the explanation for these kinds of contradiction. So if you look at the formal government, the ruling coalition, you have the prime minister, who I would place firmly on the extreme right, even by the standards of the Israeli political spectrum, and those to the even more extreme right of him, who are dead set against accepting any ceasefire, primarily for reasons we've already discussed, but also others we can get into later. Then you have also the religious parties. These are basically Jewish fundamentalist parties who who primarily answer to their rabbis, and who, contrary to appearances, and what one would normally think about such, are not really on the extreme right, and who have in the past taken decisions that can be viewed as right-wing, centrist, or even center-left, because the main priorities of these religious parties is to ensure the continued flow of state resources to their communities. It is to ensure that their followers are not drafted into the Israeli military and other more parochial concerns concerning, for example, the relationship between religion and state. So those parties could go either way. They're not principally opposed to a conclusion of this war, nor are they insisting that the war is brought to an end. And then, if we look at the war cabinet, you have these other prominent opposition politicians who, at this stage at least, appear more amenable to concluding a deal that would end the war. And this is for several reasons. In part, they have a military background and are keenly aware of Israel's failures and its inability to succeed. In significant part, it is because of their close relations with the United States. So they're also more aligned with US policy than other Israeli politicians. And in part, they're seeking to instrumentalize growing Israeli public opposition to the policies of the current Israeli government with a view towards performing better in a future Israeli election once this government collapses. Then you have the security establishment. And those seem to be also divided between those who would like to continue this war for reasons we've already discussed, and that Israel is facing is coming not from Gaza or no longer from Gaza, but rather from Lebanon, Hezbollah movement, and so on. And they would like to devote their resources to yet another war on Israel's northern frontier.
How has Hamas responded to the ceasefire plan by Biden? I mean, at one place I read that Hamas has reiterated the call for immediate ceasefire, but both the plans, the Hamas plans and this plan in its content looks very similar, because even the Hamas plan didn't have all the sort of long-standing issues, whether it's right of return on settlement and stuff like that. So how has Hamas responded to this plan?
Well, there is no Hamas plan as such. What you had last month was that the mediators, Qatar and Egypt, I would not include the United States as a mediator since it's basically Israel's representative in these negotiations, presented a plan to Hamas, which Hamas accepted. Israel then rejected it, claiming that what Hamas was actually doing was accepting its own revised version of that plan, which was not the case. The Israelis then claimed that the Egyptian mediator had given different versions of the plan to Israel and to Hamas, hoping that both would subsequently gaps as well. But it collapsed. What you've now had is the US, and not just the US, but the US head of state, President Biden, publicly presenting an initiative, which, in his words, was not a US initiative, but an Israeli initiative, raising the immediate question of, if this is an Israeli initiative, why is it being presented by Biden and not Netanyahu? And then, given that this was an Israeli initiative, how did the Israelis respond? They essentially rejected it. First, they claimed that what Biden presented is not what Israel had communicated to the Americans, which was not the case. And then you had senior US officials leaking to the press that Biden essentially presented exactly what the United States had received from the Americans. Then the Israelis claimed that, if I remember correctly, that there were additional elements communicated to the Americans that the Americans did not present. That also appears to be agitprop. Then the Israelis claimed that actually this had been communicated to the Americans confidentially and that Biden was not authorized to make it public. And then you had a whole crisis within the Israeli government of several ministers, basically the ultra-right, claiming that they had not been provided advance copies of this initiative by the Israeli prime minister, and that if it went ahead, they would leave the government and the government would collapse. And then you had Netanyahu is create sufficient skepticism within Hamas so that Hamas will reject the initiative, and then Israel can, in its own view, come out smelling like a rose. And the most recent position of the Israeli government is that it will not send negotiators to Qatar to engage with this initiative unless and until Hamas first accepts this Israeli proposal. Hamas has taken a somewhat ambivalent position on this. On the one hand, it has said that it positively with the initiative, but at the same time, I think Hamas smells a rat. In other words, it's seeking guarantees, not from the Egyptians or the Qataris, not from the Americans, but it wants the Israelis to explicitly state that this plan will meet its fundamental objective, which are implicit in the plan: a permanent end to hostilities, a comprehensive Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, the ability of displaced Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to return to their homes or whatever is left or not left of them in the northern Gaza Strip, and so on. And I think Hamas's determination to acquire these assurances is entirely reasonable, particularly given that in his own presentation, Biden had specified that those would be the outcome of this initiative, but I don't think they're going to get them from the Israelis. So how have the Americans responded to Israel's essentially rejection of what the Americans have insisted is an Israeli plan? Well, they have tried to put the onus on Hamas. And one of the most bizarre developments in recent diplomatic history, the United States presented a draft resolution to the UN Security Council whose main demand was that Hamas accept this plan. It didn't even mention Israel or call upon Israel to accept it as well. And that just shows you how far off the reservation the Americans have gone when it comes to their unconditional embrace of whatever the Israeli policy of the day is.
Going beyond the ceasefire plan in terms of American attitude towards this conflict, I'm trying to discuss a little bit in general. Um, on one hand, we are seeing continued support of the American establishment, including the defense industry. In fact, today, Al Jazeera's investigation at the Al Sardi school in Nusayrat attack reveals that they find weapons manufactured by US manufacturers like Honeywell, including sensors and stuff from the rubble. So there is a continuation or continuity in terms of its defense relationship with Israel. And yet there seems to be some kind of very unclear shift within the political narrative. I mean, Biden and others began by doubling down on the mainstream narrative. And it seems we have reached a stage after, a series of civil disobedience on one hand on the streets of the US, but also the most blatantness of how the Israeli criminals are behaving. where Biden now said, this is Financial Times reporting, that it's pretty clear that Netanyahu is acting as an impediment to the ceasefire for his own political goals. How do you read the American attitude? And by American attitude, I mean the attitude of the ruling elites towards this conflict.
Well, I would make several observations. If you go back to the administration of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, or at most Richard Nixon, who succeeded him, every time an American president leaves office, he is hailed by Israel as the best friend that Israel has ever had in the White House. So each successive president is hailed as being an even better friend than his predecessor. And that's always been true. I mean, if you look at aggression of US policy towards Israel from the Kennedy Johnson years to Trump and Biden, it's certainly true that every president has proven to be more aligned with Israel than his predecessor. I think after Biden leaves office, it may be the first time in decades that his successor may encounter challenges being hailed as the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House, because Biden has set the bar so exceptionally high for his successor. And I think, Israel's, in my view, most valuable strategic asset, certainly since the 1960s, has been, yes, it gets weapons deliveries and Security Council vetoes and all the rest of it. But I would argue that its most valuable strategic asset has been the solid bipartisan political support it has enjoyed in the US from US political elites, particularly in Congress. And it's worth recalling um, that the core of U.S. support for Israel used to be not among conservative Republicans, who in decades past were somewhat more rational than the current bunch, and were seen as overly aligned with big business and the oil lobby, and therefore more receptive to the sensitivities of Arab governments. It used to be among, in fact, liberal Democrats. That's now beginning to change, where for a variety of reasons that I won't get into here, but for a variety of reasons, Israel has become an increasingly partisan issue in US politics. It's increasingly aligned with the Republican right rather than bipartisan. You're seeing now that within the Democratic Party, even though the leadership of that party is still extremely closely, beginning to see some fissures and fractures in what had previously been the solid across the board support of the Democratic Party establishment for Israel. But generally speaking, I think if you look at this administration in particular, I mean, you look at Biden. Biden came of political age during the Cold War, in an era where Israel in 1956 and 1967, to a certain extent in 1973 and 1982, had demonstrated itself a reliable proxy for Western interests in the Middle East. Former U.S. Secretary of State Alexander Haig, among others, referred to Israel as a stationary aircraft least, because we have Israel to protect and promote our interests in the region. So that's kind of the worldview he comes from. Associated with that worldview is also, I believe, a very deep-seated racist hostility to Arabs and to Muslims in particular. And I would add that in the aftermath of September 2001, it has expanded more generally to Muslims. And and I think, he is of that generation in US political elites that basically look at Palestinians as irrelevant and expendable human scum, and that the world would be better off if there weren't any, if they, the world would be better off if they were no longer there. So, people keep complaining that Biden isn't showing empathy to Palestinians. What they don't understand is he couldn't do it if his life depended on it. This is deep-seated ideological background that he comes from, and his passionate embrace of Israel is based on this background. I mean, he proclaims himself a Zionist, demonstrating once again not only does one not need to be Jewish to be a Zionist, but most Zionists today are in fact not Jewish. There are many more Christian evangelical Zionists, for example, than there are Jewish Zionists. But just to get back to your point, this is the milieu from which Biden comes, and it's shared by many of his generation, and that I think helps explain the inability to be critical of Israel, the inability to use U.S. leverage with Israel, the inability to impose consequences on Israel for its genocidal war crimes, and the refusal to use the leverage that the U.S. has to alter Israel's behavior. It's not in their DNA. At the same time, of course, you've seen, in my view, rather rapid and surprising transformation of Western and particularly U.S. public opinion towards towards a question of Palestine during the past year. It didn't emerge out of nowhere, out of a vacuum. It has been building for several years. And I think part of it reflects precisely this issue that we're talking about. But I think it's also representative of a deeper chasm between ruler and ruled in the West and in the United States in particular.
I wanted to discuss briefly the rising tension on the Lebanon border. I mean, this has been going on since October 7, but at this moment, there seems to be more and more reports coming out of it. There was one Israeli soldier reportedly killed, and then Netanyahu started making visits to these bordering areas. Ben-Gvir went and said that um, Hezbollah should be burned down. I mean, just the sort of savagery of the language that is used. Um, the commentator seems to be divided on this. I mean, there are a group of commentators who say that, or who claim that Israel would never dare to escalate these conflicts beyond these occasional like cross-border firing because they got a bloody nose in 2016. Sure, they displaced maybe 900,000 people, but they knew that Hezbollah has precision-guided missiles and sophisticated weapons, and perhaps they have gained further strength by participating in the Syrian wars since the mid 2000s. And then there are other groups of people who says that Israel is constantly provoking to drag Hezbollah into this conflict. What's your reading of what's going on at that front?
Excuse me. Well, I'm not a historian of the Second World War, but I suspect that if you were to go back to 1940, you would also come across many perfectly rational analysts who would say that Hitler would never dare invade the Soviet Union because it was bound to result in a shattering defeat for Germany. He did so anyway. And so, while I think if you look at the situation rationally and objectively, you cannot but conclude that Israel simply does not have the capacity to fight a two-front war, um, given its consistent failures in the Gaza Strip. It can't possibly be stupid enough to then launch a war against a much more powerful and much more capable adversary in Lebanon. While all those things might be right, it doesn't mean that Israel is not going to either launch or provoke or fall into a full-scale conflict with Lebanon. I mean, applying cold, calculated, rational analysis to these kinds of situations is often precarious, but particularly so when you're dealing with an irrational regime like Israel. Now, what's happened in Lebanon is that on the 8th of October, after the October 7th attack, and as Israel was begun its military offensive against the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon opened what it called the Solidarity Front. In other words, rather than launching a full-scale offensive of its own against Israel, it engaged in a series of attacks against Israel whose purpose was to, let's say, divert Israeli military resources to the Lebanese border so that they couldn't be used in the Gaza Strip, to keep the Israelis guessing. And basically, it was intended as a solidarity front. I'll leave it at that. Subsequently, the United States, whose one consistent policy since October of last year has been, at least at the formal level, in opposition to further regional escalation, sent 2 aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean in order to intimidate Hezbollah and hopefully put an end to its attacks on Israel. Didn't work. Hezbollah wasn't intimidated. And in any case, if the US had gotten engaged, it would be assisting Israel with essentially air power, which is arguably the one thing that Israel doesn't need because it has absolute mastery of the skies to begin with. So what you've had since then is what's been called controlled escalation, where Israel and Hezbollah have been engaged in consistent attacks on each other. And these attacks have consistently gone up the escalatory ladder, but have not erupted into a full scale war. And I will make what I think is one important observation is that if you look at the casualties on the northern front, um, relative to the amount of weaponry and ordnance that Israel has used in Lebanon, Lebanese civilian casualties have actually been quite low. And what this shows, for Israel, civilian casualties have always been an objective in and of themselves because it sees such mass murder as generating pressure on its enemies to cease and desist. But in this case, it hasn't done so, even though Lebanon was the original site of what the current member of Israel's war cabinet, Gadi Eisenkot, called the Dahya Doctrine. The Dahya Doctrine is an Israeli military doctrine where, as I was just explaining, if you're faced, and it refers to the Dahya, the southern suburbs of Beirut, and basically, as the way Eisenkot explained it, when you go to war against an adversary, you deliberately inflict massively disproportionate death and destruction. You target civilian infrastructure, you target the civilian population. You basically try to raise entire neighborhoods to the ground in order to generate political pressure on your adversary. There's been no sign of the Dahya Doctrine in Lebanon since October 8th. And quite clearly, Hezbollah has successfully deterred Israel and intimidated Israel because the Israelis keep saying, don't forget, we can do to Beirut what we've done to Gaza. But they understand very well that while that's true, Hezbollah can also do to Tel Aviv much of what Israel has done to Gaza. So it's managed to create a certain balance of power, a balance of deterrence with Israel, that perhaps for the first time in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict has deterred Israel from pursuing mass civilian casualties as a military objective. Um, so it seems that the Americans have early on there were reports that the Israelis, and particularly the defense minister Yoav Gallant, who's known as something of a gambler, wanted to immediately also launch a full-scale attack on Lebanon, not only on the Gaza Strip. And according to the available reporting, the Americans called off this Israeli attack. They sent the two aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean, and basically informed the Israelis that if Hezbollah were to launch a full-scale war against Israel, the Americans would directly participate in Israel's defense, but this would not apply if it was Israel that initiated the war. And that's kind of governed this issue for the past 8 months. But I think now we're in a situation, given the escalation and given a number of other factors, that Israel may well be on the verge of seeking to launch or provoke a full-scale war with Lebanon, which many people believe and hope will be a strategic catastrophe for Israel.
I think this brings me to this very difficult question about strategies of resistance when it comes to Palestinian people. I mean, as you said, for Lebanon, for Hezbollah, armed rebellion, armed resistance has definitely worked. Uh, uh, um, um, but when it comes to the Palestinians, it becomes trickier because Hamas is not as strong as Hezbollah, and there are other dimensions to it. We had Norman Finkelstein recently, and we discussed his book on Gaza and Inquest into its martyrdom, and we discussed this complicated topic of self-defense. And back in the days when he wrote the book, he said that his diagnosis, as I read it, was that since there is a significant asymmetry of military power, it's perhaps like civil disobedience, peaceful protest, and so on that would eventually be the way forward for the peace. But it seems like what happened in 2018 and what has happened since October, uh, the it has become more complicated. So what I was interested in hearing, what are your thoughts about the strategic prudence of armed rebellion when it comes to the Palestinian resistance movement? And this is not to say that it's armed rebellion or BDS, armed rebellion
Right.
or peaceful protest. I mean, perhaps we need a multi-pronged strategy, but if you can comment on these sort of political
Yes.
strategies.
Yes. Well, I would start by saying that when it comes to resistance, I would rule nothing out that does not violate the laws of war. And that even if a non-violent strategy is decided by Palestinian consensus, um, even in such cases, the right to use armed force should never be renounced, pending a conclusive political resolution. You know, many people who, and I'm not including you or Norman Finkelstein in this, but you will find, particularly in the West, many people promoting the idea of Palestinian nonviolent resistance. This was also promoted by the current Palestinian Quisling president, Mahmoud Abbas. But when you encounter these people and they start talking about how important it is for the Palestinians to lay down their arms and focus on peaceful methods of protest and resistance, because this will bring them closer to their objectives and generate international sympathy and so on, you ask them a simple question. Okay, I agree with you. Name me one form of nonviolent Palestinian protest that you would be willing to publicly endorse. And I've had such conversations with, for example, European diplomats. all you get is a blank and bemused stare because you're not prepared to go on the record endorsing any form of Palestinian opposition to Israel. What could be, regardless of the rights and wrongs of BDS, I don't want to get into that discussion, but what could possibly be more nonviolent, more peaceful than BDS? I mean, it doesn't even, they don't even use water pistols. They don't even throw pebbles. Um, what could possibly be more peaceful than BDS? And look at the fate of BDS in the West. It's been comprehensively denounced and demonized and delegitimized and even criminalized. People have lost their jobs and their livelihoods because of their association with this, by definition, peaceful form of opposition to Israeli apartheid, and so on. So I would start by saying that usually when people who have no previous association with Palestinian rights start sanctimoniously pontificating about nonviolent resistance, if you smell a rat, it's because there is a rat. So that would be my first observation. My second observation is that I don't think the Palestinians, I mean, given the enormous disparity of power, and despite the past 8 months, it remains an enormous disparity of power, and given their isolation, and all these other factors, the Palestinians are not in a position to adopt any single mode of resistance to the exclusion of others, whether it's armed resistance or mass mobilization or. My third observation is that this is not really a question for me or you or any other individual to answer. This is a matter of the utmost strategic importance and is an utmost strategic priority that can and should only be answered by a legitimate Palestinian leadership that is genuinely representative of the Palestinian people in its entirety and that is capable of mobilizing its most important resource, the Palestinian people, in support of direct participation in such a strategy. So what's really needed, I think, is a new leadership that, it doesn't have to be a collective leadership, but it is a leadership that should include representatives of all the key actors on the Palestinian
Can I
political scene.
interrupt you for a moment
Yes,
here? I mean,
yes,
when it comes to the West Bank, it seems there is a consensus about the need for a new leadership. But when it comes
yes.
to Gaza, we had Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone, and he argues that it's very important for the world to now recognize Hamas as the most legitimate um, representative. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't think the world should recognize any Palestinian political movement. The world, I think, is under an obligation to confirm that the question of Palestinian leadership is a question for Palestinians to resolve. It's for the Palestinians, not for the Israelis or the Europeans or the Americans or anyone else to decide who leads the Palestinian people. That is a decision to be made by Palestinians. And just as foreign powers or let's say foreign states in the United States don't recognize the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or the Green Party or whatever, they recognize the government of the United States. I think the same principle applies here. Don't interfere with the right of the Palestinians to choose their own leadership, as you have consistently done in the past. Um, uh, Recognize, not don't seek to impose leaders on the Palestinians, and recognize those leaders which are organically generated by the Palestinians themselves through their own procedures. So that would be my response to that point.
And if it is Hamas, then it is Hamas.
Well, I think if it is Hamas, I think that would be a real problem for, and that assessment has nothing to do with what is what you hear often in the West about this. It's my own view that the current situation in which the Palestinian people find themselves cannot afford or sustain the hegemony of any one political movement to the exclusion of others.
Mhm.
This gets back to what I was saying earlier. I think the only successful way forward for the Palestinian people is to have some kind of interim leadership in which all primary Palestinian forces are represented and that they collectively agree on the basis of consensus on the way forward, somewhat similar to the way the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, operated in the 1970s and 1980s. Yes, you may have had a dominant movement, Fatah, but that had, of course, different wings in it. But all the other main organizations, Popular Front, Democratic Front, and others, were represented within the PLO and its leadership organs, participated in its decision making, and so on. And we need to find a similar formula to exit from the crisis that the Palestinian political system currently finds itself in. And only when you have that kind of genuinely representative Palestinian leadership, can you then begin to address discussions of what are our strategic objectives? Is it one state? Is it two states? Is it the international consensus? Is it to overturn the international consensus? What tactics will we use? Will it be a war of attrition? Will it be an effort to mobilize the Arab military power? Will it be popular demonstrations? Will it be BDS or whatever? Will it be different tactics in different arenas at different times? Only under such circumstances can the right decisions be made, in my view.
I just wanted to ask one final question as a
Sure.
concluding question.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, I wanted to end by asking a broader question about democracy and sanity in the world with regards to what's going on with Palestine. And I think I had two things in mind. One is the increasing recognition of several states, including what's going on in Europe. I mean, starting with Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Slovenia, but most dramatically in Spain, where the relationship has now come to a brink with its socialist leftist coalition openly, in fact, sloganeering Palestinian slogans like "from the river to the sea." But also in South Asia, streets of Maldives are like, crowded with Palestinian solidarity. And the most surprising is what's even going on in India. I mean, after the coming of the Hindu nationalists, there has been a very dramatic shift in the traditional Indian solidarity with the Arab world. But there are lots and lots of people in India who are actually supporting the Palestinian cause and pushing back against settler colonialism, part of which is reflected in Indian government recognition of Palestinian statehood in the UN recently. So that's one thing I wanted your comment. And the other thing is the deepening on democracy through these protests. I mean, I had the occasion to walk the streets of New York and Chicago, and I witnessed dramatically, the role of Arab Americans in these sit-in demonstrations, but also Black people joining it. It's really sort of a pulse towards deepening of American democracy. I mean, we talk about civil rights and the anti-Vietnam War or earlier labor during the New Deal, but Arab Americans are playing great role in fact, civilizing American public policy. So if you can tell a little bit about how the rest of the world should learn from what's going on.
Yes. Well, the observation that I've been making is, use the term international community. Mean by that is the Americans and the Europeans and their you know, Australia and so on, and that is international community tends to be shorthand for the West. What I think this crisis has revealed very visibly, something that has been implicit all along, but what is now indisputably visible is that there is in fact an international community and there is in fact a West. And these are two fundamentally different and often fundamentally opposed um, things. So, you look at votes in the United Nations General Assembly, the statements coming from different international institutions, you see quite clearly, that you have not only the international community versus the West, um, but primarily also a fundamental contradiction between what is it called, the rules-based international order versus the international community. The rules-based international order basically means the rules apply to you, and we will hold you to the strictest possible standard. But we ourselves and our friends get a pass. We can trample them underfoot at will, and don't you dare seek to hold us accountable for violating the standards that we insist that you respect. And then you have, the international community, which says, well, the same standards apply to all. Um, uh, you know, there are laws of warfare, there's international law, there's accountability, and so on. Whereas a rules-based international order says, no, we enjoy total impunity. If you're dark, we can kill you without consequences, and so on. That would be my first observation. My second observation, when you asked specifically about India, um, uh, the India has, in fact, for almost a century, been a mainstay of support for the Palestinian cause. And this goes back to Mahatma Gandhi during the 1930s, coming out openly in support of what was called the Great Rebellion in Palestine between 1936 and 1939. He's written about this. And he, if I'm not mistaken, he even defended the right of the Palestinian people to take up arms against the British, the late 1930s. And I think, Palestine and India were at the time colonized by the same great power. So that enhanced it as well. And then India, after independence, and particularly after it became one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement, there was a very close relationship between the PLO and India. That began to change during the 90s when India developed relations with Israel, and particularly after the rightward shift in India's leadership. India today is Israel's most important export market for its weaponry. Israel, Modi and Netanyahu in particular are exceptionally close bosom buddies, also very closely ideologically aligned. And then there are a whole host of factors that help explain this. But I very much hope that the results of the recent elections in India, while the BJP still managed to maintain its majority, I think has been a very significant blow relative to Modi and the BJP's expectations in those elections. And I very much hope this, I unfortunately know next to nothing about Indian politics, but I very much hope that this is the beginning of a process of reversal in which India can resume its traditional role with respect to its leadership in the global South and championing of the Palestinian cause. And as a last comment, what you mentioned about democracy, and since you referred to these campus uprisings and so on, I think once again it reveals the growing chasm between ruler and ruled in the West, in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere. And moving forward, the traditional process, if you will, has been that you support the Palestinians at your peril. If you're a politician or a senior executive or whatever, and you want career advancement, you embrace Israel and you ignore the Palestinians. However, slowly and gradually, I believe that is now beginning to change, where Israel is increasingly becoming a burden to those who support it. And support for the Palestinians may not necessarily be an asset, although in some cases it is, but a career terminator that it has been for decades. And here, of course, I'm talking about the West, and this is, I think, a very significant development.
Mouin, thank you very much for your time. This was not just a pleasure, but an incredible privilege to have you on. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very. It was a real pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks a lot.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.